Late September 1879, Upper Platte Country, Wyoming Territory. The first cold had already begun moving across the prairie. It slipped under doors, through roof seams, along floorboards. Settlers answered it the usual way. They packed cracks with mud. They stacked wood higher. They patched roofs and prayed they had done enough. Then there was Silas Varga, a quiet newcomer who seemed determined to do the opposite of every sensible man around him. While others prepared for winter, Silas dug heavy blue-gray clay from a pit east of his cabin. He mixed it with buffalo grass and shredded reeds. Then he hauled it home and began pounding it against the walls of his house, not painting it, not patching it, burying it. Day after day, the earth climbed higher. First the north wall, then the east, then the west. His cabin slowly disappeared beneath a sloped mass of packed soil until it looked less like a home and more like a hill with a chimney. People stopped in the road to stare. Some laughed, some shook their heads. One man called it a mole hole. Another named it Varga's Mound. Silas answered none of them. He only lifted another shovel, dropped another load, and tamped it hard into place. If you enjoy Forgotten Frontier Wisdom, subscribe and leave a like. Because the truth of what Silas was building would not be settled by neighbors. It would be settled by winter. And that winter was coming hard enough to expose every lie wood, wind, and fire could tell. Winter would judge him soon enough. But to understand why Silas Varga worked that way, it helped to know where his hands had learned their habits. He was no frontier carpenter. He had not grown up felling pine, squaring logs, or racing storms to raise walls before snow. In the old Bennett borderlands of Europe, Silas had worked with clay bakehouses and smoke-heated rooms built to hold warmth long after the fire was done. There, a wall was not merely a barrier. A wall could store. A wall could delay. A wall could give heat back when darkness came. Silas knew the feel of wet earth, the way some men knew horseflesh. He could judge a clay mix by weight alone. He knew when a packed mass would hold its shape, when it would crack, when it would drink heat slowly, and when it would release it through the night. Those skills crossed the ocean with him. So did his wife, Mara Varga, steady and practical. So did their children, young Tomas and little Lenka, who had no use for theories if theories could not keep toes warm by dawn. The cabin they bought on the Platte was not a poor one. Ephraim Holt, the settlement's most respected builder, had raised it on a low stone footing. The saddle notches were tight, the roof line was true, the door shut cleanly. By frontier measure, it was sound work. Most men looked at that cabin and saw shelter. Silas looked at it and saw a shell. It could stand. Yes, but standing was not the same as keeping life. And in country where winter measured every mistake, that difference mattered more than pride, more than appearances, and more than the opinions of men standing in the road. That difference had already introduced itself the winter before. Silas had not begun with theories. He had begun with memory. The water barrel could grow a skin of ice by morning, though it stood not far from the stove. A pot of stew, hot enough to steam when lifted, lost its comfort within minutes once it reached the table. The cold did not always arrive like a bold wind through the door. It came meaner than that. It crept. It slid along the floorboards and wrapped itself around bare ankles. It waited for the fire to sink, then climbed into blankets and collars. Mara slept in wool and a scarf. Tomas coughed near dawn, the dry kind that came from long, cold air. Lenka tucked her feet beneath her on a chair because the floor felt like creek stone in January. Silas fed the stove until the iron glowed. Still, the warmth behaved like a frightened thing. It appeared fast, then vanished fast. Wood disappeared from the pile at a rate that unsettled him. Each armload bought too little time. Each split log felt less like fuel and more like tribute paid to a hungry machine. This was not the hardship of one bad night. It was failure with a pattern. So Silas began studying the cabin the way he once studied a poor oven that scorched bread on one side and left dough on the other. He watched the rafters, the corners, the walls after the fire burned high, the walls after it burned low. He listened to the room change when flames fell to coals. Most men watched the fire. Silas watched where the heat went after the fire had done its work, and what he saw troubled him more than the cold itself. The stove was laboring, the family was laboring, only the house was not. And it was not only his house that suffered that way. Down the road lived Jonah Pike, a teamster with broad shoulders and a habit of trusting anything common enough to have survived 10 winters. His cabin was considered respectable, tighter than some, a strong stove, small windows, heavy quilts. Good sense everywhere a man could point. Yet good sense was not the same as victory. Jonah rose 3, sometimes 4 times a night to feed the fire. Jonah Pike's wife, Eliza Pike, stuffed rags around the window frames and door trim until the room looked half repaired and half surrendered. Their children spent winter evenings inside a shrinking kingdom, no wider than a few steps around the stove. Beyond that circle, the house belonged to the cold. The same story repeated itself up and down the settlement. Men here understood timber. They knew how to notch logs, square corners, hang doors, brace roofs against wind. They fought drafts with moss, mud, cloth, and patience. But they still treated a house as a thin skin between inside and out. They knew how to slow the cold coming in. They had not yet learned how to give warmth a place to remain. So rooms grew hot near the stove, and useless 10 feet away. Wood piles sank. Sleep broke into shifts. Children learned to stay close to iron. A warm room was not the same as a warm house. Silas Varga was not merely resisting winter. He was beginning to resist an error so old and common that most men mistook it for wisdom. That error became clear one night after the children were asleep. Silas sat beside the stove and watched the fire settle down into red coals. He did not look at the flames alone. He watched the room answer them. When the fire burned high, the air warmed quickly. Faces softened. Fingers loosened. Breath no longer showed near the door. Then the flames dropped, and the change came too fast. The warmth did not fade with dignity. It fled. The cold returned, as if it had never been beaten at all. It moved back across the floor, into the corners, along the walls, toward the beds. Most men blamed wind for everything. Wind deserved blame. But wind was not the only thief. Light walls were thieves. Thin walls were thieves. Empty walls that could hold nothing were thieves. A house with no weight in it could not keep what the fire had earned. Silas looked at Mara, who was mending a sleeve near the lamplight, and spoke the way a man names an illness after finally finding it. A warm room is not the same as a warm house. She said nothing at first. She only glanced toward the children's bed, then toward the woodbox, already lower than it should have been. Silas turned one coal with the poker and gave the second truth just as quietly. Heat kept is worth more than heat made. There was no triumph in the words, no grand theory, only recognition. The problem had shape now, and once a problem had shape, a man could begin to build against it, and so Silas Varga began in earnest. He worked the borrow pit 70 yards east of the cabin, where the blue-gray gumbo clay lay deep and heavy beneath the grass roots. Each morning he cut into it with a spade, rolled the dense earth into the barrow, and hauled it home one creaking load at a time. At the wall, he mixed the clay with dry buffalo grass and shredded reed fiber, not for looks, not for comfort, for structure. The grass gave grip. The fibers tied the mass together. The clay gave weight. Then he built, not with boards, not with nails, with patience. He packed the mixture against the north wall first, where winter winds came hardest across the open country. He rammed it tight with the back of a maul and a broad wooden tamper. When one core stood firm enough to bear more, he added the next, then the next, layer by layer. By week's end, the base was thick as a wagon axle was long. By the next, the earth rose halfway to the window line. Soon the east wall followed, then the west. Only the south face remained open. Men thought that proved foolishness. It proved design. Silas left the south side clear for low winter sun. He kept the windows bright. He let daylight work where fire need not. He built the lower courses broader than the upper ones, so the berm would anchor itself and resist spring slump. Where runoff might gather, he scraped shallow drains to turn water aside. He was not smearing mud on a house. He was changing what the house was. From the road, it looked uglier each day. The sharp little cabin softened into a blunt mound of earth. Children laughed and called it a dirt fort. Grown men called it worse. Silas answered none of them. He only hauled, mixed, packed, and shaped. Inside, Mara noticed the first change before she trusted herself to name it. One evening, after the fire had fallen lower than usual, she stood near the north wall, expecting that familiar edge of cold against her skirts. It did not come. Not warmth. Not yet. But the wall no longer seemed eager to steal from the room. She said nothing. She only added one less stick to the stove that night, and waited to see if morning would expose hope as foolishness. Outside, the mound rose higher. Inside, the house had begun quietly, almost secretly, to hold its ground. The larger the mound became, the louder the laughter grew. What at first looked foolish now looked deliberate, and that unsettled people more than folly ever could. A mistake could be dismissed. A different method had to be answered. So the settlement answered with ridicule. They called it the sod hump, the mole house, Varga's mound. One man said the first heavy snow would flatten it. Another swore the buried logs would rot before spring grass returned. A third laughed that no honest man crossed an ocean to America just to crawl back into the dirt. The names traveled faster than wagons. They were repeated at the smithy, beside hitching rails, over coffee, under hats tipped low against the wind. Each telling came with more certainty than knowledge. Silas heard most of it. He did not defend himself. He did not ask to be left alone. He only changed the angle of the north berm where the prairie wind struck hardest. He widened the base another foot. He packed the outer face tighter. He corrected small slumps before others noticed them. Men used words. He used adjustments. Mara saw the cost more clearly than anyone. She saw strangers slow their horses just to stare. She saw boys point. She saw grown men smile, the mean smile reserved for someone who had stepped outside the line and failed to look ashamed. Still, Silas worked. Then came an early hard wind one evening, sharp enough to rattle loose tin and hiss under doors across the settlement. Mara stood inside near the north wall, waiting for the old draft to slide across the floorboards and bite at her ankles. It never fully arrived, only a weak remnant of it, thin and broken. She looked toward the wall of packed earth, then toward Silas, who was washing clay from his hands in silence. Inside, the house had begun answering back. Outside, one man finally came to speak for the rest. It was none other than Ephraim Holt. He rode up near sundown and tied off his horse without hurry. He studied the half-buried cabin the way a surgeon studies a wound another man has dressed badly. When he spoke, there was no laughter in it. "Silas, this needs stopping." He stepped to the berm and struck it once with the heel of his boot. The packed clay held firm. "You're trapping timber behind wet earth. Come thaw, that moisture will drive inward. The logs will sweat. They'll soften where you cannot see it. Rot starts hidden. By the time a man notices, the house is already dying." He looked at the walls he himself had built. "I know what keeps a house standing." It was more than argument. It was pride, experience, reputation, and years of hard winters speaking through one voice. Silas listened without interrupting. Mud clung to his sleeves. His hands were raw at the knuckles from tamping. Then he answered in the same calm tone he used for weather. "Wet earth, yes, if left loose, if left wrong." He laid his palm on the berm. "This clay is packed hard. Water sheds off it. Drains carry the rest away. It changes slowly. Slow things do less harm than quick ones." Ephraim frowned but said nothing. Silas continued. "Wood hates soaking. It does not hate steadiness." Then he pointed north, where the wind ran low across the grassland. Wind takes heat from everything it can touch. Board, log, roof, door. Earth gives it less to touch. For the first time, Ephraim's certainty paused, only for a moment. Then it returned. "A coffin can be packed tight too," he said. Silas gave the smallest shrug. A coffin does not warm at night. Neither man smiled. From the doorway, Mara watched in silence. She understood what was happening better than either would say aloud. Her husband was being weighed against a man the whole valley trusted. No one won that evening. No one could. Words had reached their limit. Beyond them, the plains were already sharpening themselves for winter. They sent an early warning before the true cold arrived. Late in October, a short, hard rain moved across the basin. It came cold enough to sting, warm enough to soften earth, then vanished by nightfall. By dawn, the temperature dropped fast. What had been wet turned heavy. What had been heavy turned dangerous. At the northwest corner of Silas Varga's berm, a fresh section sagged. A long crack opened near the outer face. Part of the lower slope slid outward in a slow slump and exposed a strip of log wall beneath. Mara saw it first. She stood in the yard with her shawl pulled tight and spoke the fear she had kept buried. What if Holt was right? Then the second fear, quieter and worse. What if winter comes first? Silas did not answer with comfort. He answered with work. He took a shovel to the runoff path above the corner and studied the ground the way another man might study tracks. Then he widened the drainage trench, shallower but broader, so water would spread and move instead of cutting deep. He hauled broken stone from the creek bed and packed it tight at the foot of the slope. He shaved the angle of the berm back flatter. He rebuilt the failed section in shorter lifts, tamping each one harder than before. No excuses, no wounded pride, no pretending nothing had happened. By sundown, the corner stood again, rougher than before but wiser. The lesson was plain. Good ideas could still fail in careless hands. Earth was no magic charm. It demanded grade, drainage, patience, and correction. 3 nights later, another wind came down from the north, hard enough to make loose hinges chatter across the settlement. Mara waited for that repaired corner to betray them. It did not move. Inside, the floor near the north wall stayed calmer than the rest of the room. The draft that once raced there arrived broken and thin. Silas was no wizard. He was something harder to dismiss. A man who could see a flaw, mend it, and continue before the weather noticed. That mattered because Silas Varga was not trying to build the hottest house in the settlement. He was trying to build the steadiest one. There is a difference many hard winters have hidden from good men. Insulation slows the movement of heat. It resists exchange. A coat does this. A blanket does this. Moss packed between logs does this. But mass does something else. Mass can keep score. Stone, packed earth, brick, water-heavy things can absorb warmth when warmth is plentiful, then return it after the source grows weak. They do not answer quickly. That slowness is their value. Most cabins on the Platte depended on bursts. Fire roared high, the room warmed fast, and everyone felt rich for an hour. Then the flames dropped. The walls offered nothing back, and the family began again from near zero. Silas wanted another rhythm. By banking 3 sides of the cabin with dense earth, he gave the house somewhere to place the day's excess. Heat from the stove. Heat from cooking. Heat from bodies. Heat from low winter sun striking the open south wall. Instead of escaping at once, some of it moved into material slow enough to hold it. Then night came, and night always came. When the fire sank to coals, the berm did not blaze or glow. It simply released what it had taken, little by little, in the quiet language of stored warmth. That was the whole trick. Not hotter peaks, higher floors of comfort. Not violent heat followed by panic, a slower fall. He was not building a hotter fire. He was building a slower night. And once a listener understood that, the strange hill around his cabin no longer looked like madness. It looked like arithmetic. Then December arrived to mark the sums. Winter did not enter the story as scenery. It came as force. A heavy snow rolled over the Platte Basin first, thick enough to bury fence rails, choke wagon ruts, and turn every roofline soft and white. Then the sky cleared. That was when the real danger began. Cold settled in behind the storm, hard and patient. Daylight could not lift it. Night drove it deeper. Thermometers, where men had them, sank below zero and kept going. Where men had none, axe handles told the truth, door hinges told the truth, lungs told the truth. Wind crossed the bare prairie without mercy. It found every seam. It tested every nail. It laid its invisible hand against every wall and kept it there. Nature did not shout. It did not threaten. It did not bargain. It simply moved from house to house and removed whatever had not been properly kept. From thin cabins, it took heat. From poorly banked stoves, it took fuel. From tired fathers, it took sleep. From mothers who trusted one more blanket would solve the matter, it took certainty. From proud men who mistook a fast blaze for lasting warmth, it took illusion. The settlement felt the judgment quickly. Chimneys smoked harder and longer. Doors opened less. Voices shortened. Men walked from woodshed to threshold with heads bent low, carrying armloads of wood as if feeding animals that never filled. Even Silas Varga was not exempt from the trial. His house still needed tending. Fires still had to be lit. Water still had to be carried. A wrong calculation could yet be exposed before all. That was the fairness of such winters. They favored no reputation. They cared nothing for mockery, pride, or eloquence. A man might argue with neighbors for years. He could not argue with -30 and a north wind. Across the basin, houses were being weighed. And before many more nights had passed, every family would know exactly what their walls could keep and what they could not. At the Pike cabin, frost feathered across the inside walls each morning, delicate as lace and twice as cruel. It climbed from the corners first, then spread in pale branches where breath and cooking steam had touched the cold boards in the night. The water barrel wore a skim of ice by dawn, often enough that no one commented on it anymore. Jonah Pike broke into his reserve woodpile weeks earlier than planned. Fast, too fast. Each swing of the maul sounded angrier than the last. Each armload carried indoors meant one less chance left for February. Eliza Pike held her hands over a simmering pot while her back stayed cold. She turned herself in slow circles like meat before a spit, warming one side only to surrender the other. Their children lived inside a shrinking kingdom, measured by how far the stove's kindness could reach. Beyond that circle, the room belonged to Winter. Across the road, Ephraim Holt's house proved what skill could do and what skill alone could not. His joints were tighter, his roof cleaner, his door better hung than most. But better, in weather like this, was often only another word for losing slower. The floorboards bit through socks like wet stone. His youngest boy coughed in the dark and woke the others. Ruth Holt, Ephraim's wife, hung heavy quilts across the entry and stuffed cloth at the sill plates, yet warmth still thinned and vanished from every surface the wind could touch. The stove there never seemed to rest. Neither did Ephraim. He fed it before bed. He fed it after midnight. He fed it again before first light. Jaw tight, eyes red from broken sleep. Around the settlement, chimneys smoked like signals of distress. Woodpiles shrank, tempers shortened. Rooms grew smaller, tighter, meaner. And with every house that struggled, one question grew heavier in the minds of those who had laughed. How was the Mound House faring now? Not with spectacle, not with roaring heat or shirt-sleeve comfort in the dead of Wyoming winter. It was doing something quieter, and in many ways harder to achieve. It was behaving normally. Inside the Varga cabin, the stove was still lit each day. Wood was still burned. Ash still had to be carried out. Water still had to be hauled in. No miracle had erased work, but the work no longer felt desperate. A morning fire could burn down into steady coals without sending the room into sudden retreat. The sharp draft that once hunted ankles along the floorboards had weakened into almost nothing. The boards themselves were still cool, but no longer cruel. At the south window, where low winter sun laid a pale square of light, a small crock of onion tops and parsley remained green. Under a cloth near the shelf, Mara's rye starter still breathed, slow bubbles rising through the paste. In many cabins that week, such a thing would have died into a cold lump. Tomas sat near the far corner carving at a scrap of pine instead of crowding the stove. Lenka slept later into the morning, without waking to cry that her feet hurt. Silas noticed these things and said little. He split wood. He checked the drains after snow. He turned the coals when needed. He added fuel as a man tends a system, not as a man fights a fire. But Mara felt the deeper change first. Winter had taken something from nearly every home in the settlement, the shape of ordinary time. Meals elsewhere were eaten quickly before bowls cooled. Nights were divided into watches by the stove. Conversations were shortened by discomfort. Families arranged themselves around one glowing iron box, as if warmth were a scarce coin. Here, supper could remain on the table without hurry. Evening could pass in one piece. The children could occupy more of the room than a few guarded feet around the fire. The house had become larger than the stove. That was the victory. Not luxury. Not excess. Not boasting rights. A life no longer organized around emergency. There are proofs more convincing than numbers. A child sleeping through dawn is one of them. Green herbs in January are another. Bread starter still alive in hard weather is another still. Silas Varga's answer to winter did not shout. It simply gave back the dignity of ordinary living. On the 9th day of the cold snap, Ephraim Holt discovered it for himself. One of his draft mares had slipped a latch in the night and wandered off. Before dawn, he pulled on every layer he owned, took a lantern, then thought better of wasting one hand to carry it in that wind. He went out in the gray instead, following hoofprints through crusted snow. The world had turned white in a new way, not just from snowfall, but from frost. Fence rails glittered, brush limbs shone pale. Every ordinary cabin along the road wore a silver skin, where leaking warmth had met murderous air and frozen fast upon the outer boards. Even his own house, when he glanced back once, stood glazed and shining. The mare's tracks led over a low rise. Ephraim climbed it, head down against the wind, then stopped so suddenly the snow squealed under his boots. Below him sat the Varga place. Wrong. In a valley bright with frost, it was dark. The mound house rose from the drifted ground as a blunt mass of brown earth, matte and plain, with no glittering coat upon it, no white crust on the berm, no shining rim at the roofline, only a thin thread of smoke lifting slow and lazy from the chimney, not the smoke of panic, the smoke of sufficiency. Ephraim stared longer than the cold allowed. Then he descended the slope, crossed the yard, and walked to the north face of the berm, the side that had taken the wind for 9 straight days. He pulled off one glove. The air bit instantly at his fingers. He pressed his bare palm against the packed earth. He expected knife cold. He expected the shock of touching frozen stone. It never came. The wall was not warm. It was something stranger and far more convincing. It lacked deep cold. It belonged neither to the stove nor to the storm, but to a steadier world between them. He could feel stored temper in it, a calmness held inside mass and time. In that moment, years of certainty split cleanly inside him. He understood why his own house glittered with wasted heat. He understood why this one did not. Wind could only steal what it could reach, and Silas Varga had moved warmth beyond the thief's hand. Ephraim kept his palm there a long moment, forgetting the mare, forgetting the road, forgetting pride. When he walked away that morning, he did not look like a man defeated in public. No crowd had seen it. No insult had been returned to him. He looked like something rarer, a man whose certainty had met a fact too solid to move. He found the mare by noon. 2 days later, he came back to the Varga place in daylight. No warning in his voice this time. No lecture prepared. He stood by the packed earth, hat in hand, and said only 2 words. "Show me." Silas nodded once, as if the request were ordinary. Then he began where all real teaching begins, with particulars. He pointed north, where the wind ran longest and hardest across open ground. He explained why that side had been banked first and thickest. He showed why the south face stayed open for winter sun. He traced the drainage lines cut to turn meltwater aside. He walked Ephraim to the northwest corner and spoke of the slump after autumn rain, how he had flattened the angle, widened the trench, added stone, rebuilt in shorter lifts. No secrets, no boasting, no savoring of reversal, only causes and corrections. Ephraim listened the way craftsmen listen when pride stops talking. He crouched to inspect the stone footing. He pressed the berm with his boot. He measured thickness with his eye. He asked short questions. Silas gave short answers. From the doorway, Mara watched and understood something winter had already made plain. Her husband no longer needed defending. The season had spoken for him. By the time Ephraim rose to leave, the old order had shifted. "In spring," he said, eyes still on the north wall. "You'll come see my place. It was not phrased as surrender. It was phrased as work to be done. He wanted banking on the windward side, better drainage by the sill, more mass, where the stoveroom lost itself too quickly after dark. Word moved quietly at first, then faster. Men who had laughed now asked questions with careful faces. The names Mole House and Sod Hump began to disappear. Mockery had built the story. Competence had ended it. And the first man to carry the lesson onward was the one most certain it could never work. When the cold finally broke, the settlement spoke of that winter in numbers. How many cords of wood were gone before February? Who had burned broken fence rails after the pile ran low? Whose livestock failed in the deep nights? Whose children coughed for weeks? Who slept in shifts to keep a stove alive? Hard seasons turned memory into arithmetic. And inside those numbers, one difference stood too large to ignore. The Varga house had burned less fuel than homes of similar size. Not none. Not some fantasy amount. Simply less enough, less that practical men paid attention. Among them was Gideon Rusk, a freight hauler who moved coal, flour, and iron along the Platte Road. He trusted scales more than stories, and invoices more than gossip. He noticed that Silas bought fuel sparingly, yet his family did not come through winter hollow-eyed and beaten. That kind of evidence travels farther than rumor. By the next autumn, men who once laughed were asking about slope angles, drainage trenches, wall exposure, and how thick a berm ought to be on the north side. Some banked only one wall, some half-buried root cellars and pantry rooms, some improved old cabins instead of building new ones. No one called it Varga's Mound anymore. First they called it Varga Banking. Then, as useful things often outgrow the names of the men who first carried them, they called it simply an earth-banked cabin. Silas himself claimed no invention. He still hauled water, still split wood, still cleared drains after storms. Men ahead of their time rarely announce themselves as such. They are too busy maintaining what works. And what he built with a shovel, a wheelbarrow, gumbo clay, and buffalo grass did not belong only to 1,879. The same logic lives on wherever people seek efficient homes, earth-sheltered walls, passive solar design, thermal storage, and buildings that waste less because they understand more. Winter still tests houses. Wind still takes what it can touch. Fast heat still fools the impatient. And strength is not always found in hardness. Sometimes strength is the power to hold something valuable long enough for it to sustain life. That was Silas Varga's true work. He did not merely warm his own home. He preserved a principle the world would have to learn again. If you had seen Silas coating his cabin with mud like a hill, would you have laughed or paid attention?